Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Michael Bloomberg, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer squared off at the 10th Democratic debate in South Carolina. The event was the last debate prior to the South Carolina primary, in which Joe Biden scored his first victory of the 2020 Democratic primary.
And my buddy Jim Clyburn, you brought me back!
Congratulations, by the way, to Mr. Biden and his campaign.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
No doubt that victory was all but secured before he even stepped foot on stage, but more crucial to this debate was the next phase in the Democratic primary contest, Super Tuesday. On March 3rd, a full third of the Democratic delegates will be assigned. In this video, I'll break down the South Carolina debate performances of each of the participating candidates. While the debate was a somewhat chaotic event, and evaluating the candidates' performances felt a little bit trickier and more up for interpretation than last time around, I'll still do my best to rank them from best to worst. At the very least, I'll try to explain who looks like a loser of this debate and who looks like a winner. Let's begin with Joe Biden, who I took to be the clearest winner of the South Carolina debate. In the Nevada debate, Joe Biden had more energy and charisma than he had demonstrated in prior debates, and he kept that momentum going in South Carolina. He had no shortage of forceful, passionate speeches, and his confidence was obvious throughout the event. While Biden may no longer be the nationwide frontrunner, he managed to retain the lead in the polls in South Carolina, and days before the state took to the polls, he was able to declare firmly that he would win the primary. But he also demonstrated humility, claiming that he intended to earn those votes. "I don't expect anything. I plan to earn the vote. I'm here to ask and really earn it. But folks, I intend to win South Carolina, and I will win the African American vote here in South Carolina." When asked whether he would continue the race even if he doesn't win South Carolina, Mr. Biden firmly repeated, "I will win South Carolina." Probably the most distinct thing about the 10th Democratic debate was how disruptive and chaotic the event was. Candidates were frequently speaking on top of one another and over their allotted times, and moderators recurrently failed to keep control. While I think a number of candidates could potentially be harmed as a result of this lack of decorum, Biden seemed to make the most of it, frequently pointing to his own refusal to perpetuate the rudeness and rowdiness. "I guess the only way to do this is just jump in and speak twice as long as you should." Normally, being a stickler for the rules might be seen as uptight, but this event really was almost unwatchable. Being the champion of the debate rules made Biden an ally of really everyone trying to watch. As a consummate critic of Medicare for All, a potential weakness of Joe Biden, as his opponents argue, is that his healthcare plan of a public option doesn't go far enough. Biden worked to counter this narrative by highlighting another way in which he would work to improve healthcare, by investing in medical research. "We're going to focus at least $50 billion over the first 5 years on obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and cancer. We're going to make that investment because no one else is willing to make that investment. We can get that done. The American people support it. Republicans will support it." Leading up to Super Tuesday, Biden needed to take aim at the frontrunner of the race, Bernie Sanders. And relying on a victory in South Carolina to help his own standing prior to the critical March 3rd contest, he needed to play to his own support with black voters. Biden did both at the same time with 2 attacks on Bernie Sanders. One effective, one a little weaker. "Walking distance from here is Mother Emanuel Church. Bernie voted 5 times against the Brady bill and wanted a waiting period of 12 hours. In addition to that, being progressive. He thought Barack Obama, he wanted to primary. He said we should primary Barack Obama. Someone should. And in fact, the president was weak and our administration was not up for it. Look, folks, let's talk about progressive. Progressive is getting things done." Now, the second argument that Biden makes, that Sanders argued in favor of potentially primarying Obama, could frustrate black voters, but the idea that this was not a progressive move is actually nonsense. Sanders, of course, considered the idea because he thought Obama wasn't progressive enough. Now, the first attack was far more legitimate. He sensibly didn't attempt to put the tragedy squarely on Sanders' shoulders, but pointing out Bernie's weaknesses in this area was a legitimate criticism in my view. Connecting it to Charleston should also make the critique play more effectively, especially for the black community. All in all, Biden's performance was very strong in this debate. He showed passion and energy, he attacked his biggest Super Tuesday rival, and he managed to escape the evening without taking damage. Other candidates didn't really go after him, and unlike in several past debates, he didn't dunk on himself. It was a clear win for the Biden team. As the frontrunner of the race, Senator Bernie Sanders received the opening question of the debate, one about Trump's economy. His response was a strong one, which essentially boiled down to pointing out the economic woes of working people. Sanders was then attacked by Bloomberg, who claimed, Vladimir Putin thinks that Donald Trump should be president of the United States, and that's why Russia is helping you get elected so you'll lose to him. Here's how Sanders responded. Let me tell Mr. Putin, who interfered in the 2016 election, tried to bring Americans against Americans. Hey, Mr. Putin, if I'm president of the United States, trust me, you're not going to interfere in any more American elections. This was a reasonably good response, but missed something very important. Bloomberg's argument that Trump and Russia prefer Sanders as the Democratic candidate is essentially an electability argument. The point is that the enemies of the Democratic Party want Sanders to win the nomination because it makes it easier for Donald Trump to get reelected. Whether or not this argument has rhetorical force is a matter of opinion. But whether or not it is true is easily checkable through polling. For Bloomberg to have merit with this argument, he needs to be clearly more electable than Bernie Sanders. But is he? Well, according to the polls, he does have a case to make. It just isn't a very good one. In the traditional swing state of Florida, the most recent poll from University of North Florida shows Bloomberg to be the most electable in the Democratic field, with plus 6 points over Donald Trump, while other major candidates Klobuchar and Buttigieg are losing. Here, Biden, Sanders, and Warren are essentially tied with the president. Florida would be an incredibly valuable state for Democrats to lock down. But this is just one poll from a pollster that 538 gives a A/B grade to, which is pretty good but not great. In a number of other states, Bernie is actually the most electable candidate in the field. Emerson found Sanders to lead the field in Colorado, tied with Biden for plus 10 points over Trump. An A-rated Survey USA poll back in November found Sanders to again essentially tie Biden as the most electable in Georgia, with plus 3 and plus 4 respectively over Trump. In Michigan, the latest poll by YouGov has Sanders and Buttigieg leading the field with plus 7 and plus 6 over Trump. Likewise, in Nevada, Sanders and Buttigieg lead the field with plus 11 points over Trump, far ahead of the other candidates. In New Mexico, Sanders leads everyone by significant margins with plus 18 over Trump. In North Carolina, Sanders and Bloomberg have a statistical tied lead over Trump with plus 5 and plus 6 respectively. In Pennsylvania, there's a clear difference, with Sanders beating Trump by 3 points and Bloomberg losing to Trump by 3. In Texas, Sanders seems to have the best chance of flipping the state blue, with just plus 2 points for Trump compared to plus 5 for Trump versus Bloomberg. In Virginia, Sanders leads with plus 9 over Trump compared to just plus 6 for Bloomberg, the lowest result amongst all the major Democrats. In Wisconsin, once again, Sanders leads the field with plus 2 over Trump, whereas Bloomberg fares second to last among the major candidates, losing to Trump by 1 point. Nationwide, RCP gives Sanders a spread of plus 4.7 points over Trump, a virtual tie of the plus 4.8 points over Trump that Biden has. As for Bloomberg, the average result is lower, plus 4.0 over Trump. That's better than Warren, Buttigieg, and Klobuchar, but it's certainly not better than Sanders. None of the last 7 head-to-head polls show Sanders losing the popular vote to Donald Trump. 2 of them show Trump beating Bloomberg. So all in all, Bloomberg is not totally unelectable. In a couple of critical states, he's among the best choices. But the idea that Sanders is less electable is not supported by the evidence. He's more electable than Bloomberg in a number of critical states, and in most cases leads the field. Nationwide, polls show that he has more support versus Trump than does Bloomberg. Sanders, and Biden too, by the way, appear to be the 2 candidates who are clearly more electable than Bloomberg. Point being, if you want to make an argument about electability, it helps if you're more electable than the candidate you're attacking. Sanders faltered in that he responded to the Russia part of the attack, but did not point out his own electability. He did recover, however, from this error by pointing to the head-to-head polling a little later in the debate. Of the last 50 polls that have been done nationally, Mr. Bloomberg, I beat Trump 47 of those 50 times. If you look at battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the polling shows that I beat Trump. And if you want to beat Trump, you're going to need an unprecedented grassroots movement of black and white and Latino, Native American, and Asian people who are standing up and fighting for justice. That's what our movement is about. Following Bloomberg's attacks about Russia at the top of the debate, Bernie was then attacked by Elizabeth Warren, then Pete Buttigieg, then Tom Steyer, and then Joe Biden before he was given a chance to respond. Not 20 seconds into his response, he was already getting interrupted by Pete Buttigieg. I'm hearing my name mentioned a little bit tonight. I wonder why. And maybe, Pete mentions what the American people want. I'll tell you, Pete, what the American people want, and Joe, what the American people want, they don't want candidates to be running to billionaires for huge amounts of funding. All right, let's clear this up once and for all. Pete has gotten funding from over 50
Now
billionaires.
You've got people believing
Joe,
something
I think, has gotten funding from a little bit more.
Clearing
what
up.
The American people want, by the way,
right.
And a lot of issues we'll be discussing tonight are issues I raised 4 years ago: raising the minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour, making public colleges and universities tuition free, and finally, doing what every other major country does, guaranteeing healthcare to all people as a human right through a Medicare for all single-payer system. This was a pattern that repeated itself throughout much of the debate. While every other candidate was given a chance to respond when they were attacked, several times Sanders was attacked without being given a chance to respond. Or when he would get interrupted, most often by Pete Buttigieg. This cuts both ways for Sanders. Not getting a chance to respond to the attacks allowed the attacks to sit, so undecided voters and supporters of other candidates likely became increasingly unlikely to support Sanders. On the other hand, the fact that moderators seemed to tilt the tables against Sanders here probably worked to mobilize and intensify his existing base of support, as many of his supporters are already suspicious of mainstream media and establishment bias against Sanders. Were Sanders struggling to lead the Democratic field, this would essentially add up to a downside for his debate performance. But as the frontrunner, it might actually amount to a net positive. While Sanders, of course, already has very dedicated supporters, one area where he probably generally struggles with is appealing to voters who aren't particularly interested in a political revolution. More pragmatic voters who think that Sanders is an all-or-nothing guy who can't make progress in small steps. In this debate, Sanders actually did a reasonable job of highlighting some of his less-than-radical proposals and lesser-known legislation he's created. For example, very proud working with Jim Clyburn of South Carolina that we increased funding for the Community Health Center program by $11 billion as part of the Affordable Care Act, which now provides for 9 million Americans access to primary health care, dental care, mental health counseling, and low-cost prescription drugs. In that bill, we also put $2 billion into a program which would provide debt forgiveness for doctors, nurses, dentists, to make sure they are practicing in underserved areas. Sanders did, however, take some damage in some areas, even when he was given a chance to respond to attacks. For example, he was asked how he would pay for his policy proposals, like Medicare for All. In particular, he was asked to do the math on his recently released document explaining how he would fund his programs. The first line of his response was, "How many hours do you have?" The glib response of how many hours you have makes it seem like Sanders has something to hide when it comes to paying for his programs. His website lays out ways to pay for many of his proposals, but there are still holes. When it comes to Medicare for All in particular, this program actually is accounted for in his revenue proposal. Citing figures from CMS.org, his campaign projects spending under the current system to be $30 trillion. And the total cost of Medicare for All to be $47 trillion based on the recent article published in Lancet. Bernie's campaign comes up with a menu of new revenue sources amounting to $17.5 trillion, more than the difference of the current spending and Medicare for All's total 10-year price tag, which means if paired with these new taxes, his proposal would be deficit neutral. While Bernie touches on some of this in his responses, he doesn't really put together the full picture. Probably would have helped if he wasn't getting interrupted by other candidates, but Bernie really didn't string it all together here as well as his website does. If I hadn't read his website, I'd probably think he has not accounted for how to pay for Medicare for all. Another weakness in Sanders' debate performance was the fact that an area of weakness in his record was brought up. You've gone after the insurance industry, you've taken on pharmaceutical companies, and you've taken on big tech. Why did you vote repeatedly to give gun manufacturers a pass? As I've said a number of times, this is an area where Sanders' record is mixed. While I don't think it's a significant enough issue to bring down his campaign, it clearly damages his progressive image. Here's Sanders' response. I have cast thousands of votes, including bad votes. That was a bad vote. I have today a D- voting record from the NRA. 30 years ago, I likely lost a race for the one seat in Congress in Vermont because I supported a ban on assault weapons. Right now, my view is we need to expand background checks and the gun show loophole and do what the American people want, not what the NRA wants. So Sanders does some work here to mitigate the damage, but all that really does is soften the blow. This stuff certainly doesn't help with Democrats, especially not the left wing of the party, which is his base. Finally, let's talk about another major issue raised for Bernie Sanders in this debate. Here, I think the criticism Sanders is facing is, well, stupid. The question he was asked was, can Americans trust that a Democratic Socialist president will not give authoritarians a free pass? Sanders emphasized that he has opposed authoritarianism all over the world. He said that, of course, the Cuban government is a real dictatorship, and went on to compare his comments regarding Cuban progress on education to Obama saying that Cuba had made great progress on education and healthcare. Joe Biden attempted to draw a distinction, shouting that Obama had never embraced an authoritarian regime, whereas Sanders did not condemn what they did. Sanders responded, that is untrue, categorically untrue, and repeated that he has called out authoritarianism all over the world, including in Cuba. Authoritarianism of any stripe is bad. That's different than saying occasionally that governments are doing things that are good. This is honestly just a dumb conversation to be having. Castro was a dictator, who, by the way, replaced a US-backed dictator, Batista. Castro did a lot of terrible things, not least of which was creating a one-party communist state, arresting tens of thousands of people for being counter-revolutionaries, persecuting gays, mismanaging the Cuban economy, and greatly endangering the safety of the island by provoking the United States. Castro also did a lot of good things in terms of healthcare and education, drastically raising literacy rates and providing medicine not only to the poor people in Cuba, but also exporting doctors all over the developing world. By 2007, Cuba was providing more medical personnel to the developing world than all the G8 countries combined. It would be nice to think that Democratic voters were wise enough to realize that the world isn't just made up of bad guys and good guys, and that having a slightly more nuanced perspective on foreign policy was also politically expedient. But I'm not 100% sure that is the case. It is likely that saying positive things, even totally true positive things, about Fidel Castro will be a liability for Sanders, especially in Florida, with its large population of Cuban expats who fled the island to escape Castro's regime. This, of course, doesn't much chip away at Bernie Sanders' standing in Super Tuesday, however, as Florida does not vote until March 17th, nor does it affect the primary race overall, as Biden and Bloomberg were already ahead in that state. Overall, Sanders had low points in this debate, as well as a number of strong moments. The mixed performance will probably not have a strong impact on the polls either way. As the frontrunner in the race, that's good enough to be considered a win. Probably not as effective a debate as Biden had, but a second-place finish nonetheless. Sanders wasn't the only candidate to have a mixed performance in South Carolina. Warren, Klobuchar, Steyer, and Buttigieg all had high and low points. In fact, the four were so even in their overall performances that it's probably reasonable to call it a four-way tie for third place. But for better and for worse, the most interesting performance of the lot came from Mayor Pete. Pete had plenty of positives in his debate performance. Perhaps his strongest moment was a short speech about the standing of America in the world, in which he tied in a reference to his own military experience. One of the things that kept me safe just as sure as my body armor was the fact that the flag on my shoulder represented a country that was known to keep its word. Our allies and our adversaries knew it. The president has torn that to shreds, so the first thing we need to do is restore the credibility of the United States. Pete also did some work to counter the idea, pushed by his progressive rivals, that his campaign is bought by billionaires. He explained that he's received more money just from the small dollar donations that have come in from Charleston than he has from billionaires. He then joked that he didn't want to miss an opportunity and proceeded to tell viewers to go to his website and to donate, adding, "If you're a billionaire, I will raise your taxes. But if you'd like to defeat Donald Trump, please go to PeteForAmerica.com and donate the legal maximum." Key to the effectiveness of that speech is that Pete points out that he plans on raising the taxes of billionaires. Sure, he still gets their support, and sure, his plans don't go anywhere near the wealth taxes proposed by Sanders or Warren, but emphasizing that he's planning on raising their taxes does do some work to repair his image as a puppet of wealthy donors. Now, this being a debate in South Carolina, Pete also made a strong plea to black voters. He talked about rural poverty and voter suppression, adding, "See, all these things are connected. Housing, wages, the ability to get anything meaningful passed on criminal justice reform. All of these things are going to be harder to deal with as long as black voices are systematically excluded from political participation." Pete again made an argument designed to pull in black voters, a demographic he currently struggles with, in his criticisms for Michael Bloomberg. He argued that stop and frisk was racist. In effect, it was, because it was about profiling people based on their race. And the mayor even said that they disproportionately stopped white people too often and minorities too little. And I'm not here to score points. I come at this with a great deal of humility because we have had a lot of issues, especially when it comes to racial justice and policing in my own community. That point in particular, where he cops to the problems he himself has had in dealing with racial issues in his own city, should work toward healing his own relationship with the black community. It's hard to win over voters of a group when you can't fess up to your own past mistakes. And I come at this with some humility because I'm conscious of the fact that there are 7 white people on this stage talking about racial justice. None of us have the experience, the lived experience. I think this answer does show some humility and empathy. And while it in some ways can be seen as an attack on Bloomberg, it is, in a larger sense, Pete humbling himself before black voters. This, I think, might open more black voters up to considering Pete as a potential candidate, although, of course, it's likely too little too late, especially now that he's dropped out of the race. But credit where credit is due, it's a step in the right direction. Pete was also wise to focus the majority of his attacks on the frontrunner of the primary race, Bernie Sanders. Here he is making an argument about divisiveness, sure to score him points among suburbanites, moderates, and older voters. I'm not looking forward to a scenario where it comes down to Donald Trump with his nostalgia for the social order of the 1950s and Bernie Sanders with the nostalgia for the revolutionary politics of the 1960s. There's a majority of American people who I think right now just want to be able to turn on the TV, see their president, and actually feel their blood pressure go down a little bit instead of up through the roof. A somewhat less effective argument coming from Buttigieg was over the issue of electability. He argued that Bernie's politics will get Donald Trump re-elected, give the House to Republicans, and make it impossible for Democrats to gain a majority in the Senate. Now, when it comes to the coattail effect, Pete may very well have a point that an extremely progressive candidate will be less effective in helping congressional Democrats win in purple districts and states. Truth be told, we don't actually know that for sure, since there has not really been an extremely progressive Democratic president since FDR. But when it comes to actually beating Donald Trump, as I mentioned in the Bernie Sanders section of this video, Pete has absolutely no case to make. Polling shows nationwide, and in state after state, Sanders is far more electable than Pete Buttigieg. He's probably the most electable candidate in the field, seriously rivaled only by Joe Biden. Now, the general effort of Pete's to go after Sanders aggressively was a strong debate strategy, one that might very well improve his standing among moderate Democrats who feel that Sanders is too radical. But one tactic Pete employed pursuant this strategy was, in my view, extremely counterproductive.
And I challenge everyone. Senator Klobuchar, next question.
Pete constantly interrupted Sanders and other candidates when it was not his turn to talk. This debate was incredibly frustrating to watch because of how much candidates were talking over one another. The moderators have caught plenty of heat for not being able to control the debate. But I think if you're running for president, you should also be accountable for your actions. And while there was generally a lot of crosstalk in this debate, no one was even close to as consistently disruptive as Pete Buttigieg. I personally found it to be completely obnoxious, and I think plenty of debate viewers felt the same way. The lack of decorum somewhat undermines his arguments about civility and divisiveness. I could certainly see older, undecided voters to lean more toward Biden, who demonstrated more personal discipline throughout the event. On the whole, Pete's disruptive behavior was not enough to make the debate a total loser for him, as he had plenty of positive moments to counteract the negative effects. But with his Iowa and New Hampshire bumps fading into the past, Pete's mixed performance was probably not sufficient to count as a win. Polling does not suggest he'll be a serious contender on Super Tuesday, and I don't expect this debate performance to change anything. Elizabeth Warren's performance at the South Carolina debate was most noteworthy for being utterly unremarkable. While in the Nevada debate, she dominated the debate stage, she faded into the background this time around. While Warren suffered no real damage lobbed by other candidates, she didn't make her presence felt either. With her diminishing standing in the nationwide polls, she could not afford to have a less than stellar performance at this debate, and unfortunately for her, that's exactly what she had. Warren's most interesting moments came in the form of attacks on other candidates, particularly Bernie Sanders and Michael Bloomberg. She pressed Bloomberg on his and his company's treatment of women, which I'll talk about during the Bloomberg section of this video. She also attacked the former New York City mayor on his funding of Republican senators. Who funded Lindsey Graham's campaign for re-election last time? It was Mayor Bloomberg, and that wasn't the only right-wing senator that Mayor Bloomberg has funded. In 2016, he dumped $12 million into the Pennsylvania Senate race to help re-elect an anti-choice right-wing Republican senator, and I just want to say the woman challenger was terrific. She lost by a single point. In 2012, he scooped in to try to defend another Republican senator against a woman challenger. That was me. It didn't work, but he tried hard. Not that this wasn't a strong moment for Warren, but it did far more to damage Bloomberg than it did to propel her campaign forward. She actually had a more sophisticated attack against Sanders, where she combined attacks of Bernie with advocacy for her own campaign. The way I see it is that Bernie is winning right now because the Democratic Party is a progressive party, and progressive ideas are popular ideas, even if there are a lot of people on this stage who don't want to say so. Bernie and I agree on many things, but I think I would make a better president than Bernie. And the reason for that is that getting a progressive agenda enacted is going to be really hard, and it's going to take someone who digs into the details to make it happen. This point about digging into the details is an effective attack. It highlights the brand she's created for herself as a policy wonk, with the slogan, "I've got a plan for that." Simultaneously, it piles on the critique of Bernie Sanders that his plans to pay for his plans are insufficient. Bernie and I both wanted to help rein in Wall Street. In 2008, we got our chance, but I dug in, I fought the big banks, I built the coalitions, and I won. This again plays to Warren's strengths, a reference to her work in creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Bernie and I both want to see universal health care, but Bernie's plan doesn't explain how we're going to get there, doesn't show how we're going to get enough allies into it, and doesn't show enough about how we're going to pay for it. Again, this is probably a pretty effective attack, as Bernie's constantly criticized along the lines of paying for Medicare for all. Warren's proposal for paying for Medicare for all is arguably quite a bit more lofty than the plan Sanders has. While Sanders' plan includes a payroll tax, similar to how single-payer healthcare is paid for in most countries, Warren's ambition was to pay for healthcare without raising taxes on the middle class. The largest new tax, valued at $9 trillion in new revenue, is from employers, expecting that they pay the government essentially the same amount that they currently spend on private healthcare plans. That's certainly an interesting idea, and there's good reason to suspect it would work. After all, corporations are already forced to spend that money anyway to maintain the status quo. But her plan also requires the redirection of the funding currently allocated to the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, the taxation of new immigrants as a result of passing comprehensive immigration reform, and a massive increase in IRS enforcement to gain $2.3 trillion in new taxes. Another $2.9 trillion is expected to come from managing to tax corporations on foreign earnings. Now, I love all of these ideas, but they're lofty goals, not easy to pass plans. It's hard to snap your fingers and close a piece of the military, pass comprehensive immigration reform, improve the competence of the IRS, and get corporations to give up their tax havens. Sanders' list of new tax streams include far more practical measures, like raising the top federal corporate income tax rate, taxing capital gains, and capping the state and local tax deduction for married couples. Sanders may be the one calling for a political revolution, but it's Warren's plan to raise revenue for healthcare that sounds a lot more like starry-eyed idealism. Warren continued her attack on Bernie. I dug in. I did the work, and then Bernie's team trashed me for it. We need a president who is going to dig in, do the hard work, and actually get it done. Progressives have got one shot, and we need to spend it with a leader who will get something done. Whether or not you believe that the anonymously posted talking points that included an argument against Warren's electability were actually from the Sanders campaign, and whether or not you believe that calling her supporters more reliable Democratic voters is some kind of insult, Warren's complaints about this issue, added with her claims that Sanders told her in a secret one-on-one meeting that, contrary to everything he said publicly throughout his entire career, he in fact does not think a woman could win the presidency, going toe-to-toe with Bernie on these issues was the last stand she made for her campaign several weeks ago. Soon after, she dropped in the polls as he surged. Possibly this confrontation caused this. What's certain is that it did not prevent this from happening. On a more personal note, I think that complaining that Sanders supporters are trashing her campaign is not just politically inexpedient, it also casts her in a pretty negative light. In my view, they should be criticizing her and her campaign, just as her supporters should be criticizing Sanders and his campaign. That's ideally how democracy works. Voters discuss what they do and don't like about candidates in order to inform their choices of who to support. Factors including experience, ideology, and yes, electability should be top of mind. I have friends who prefer Warren, and they've told me things like they prefer a female candidate, or they think Warren is more practical, or they think she'd be more unifying for the Democratic Party, or even that they just like her more. These are fair arguments to make. And as a Sanders supporter myself, I would hope that Bernie wouldn't whine about it on national television if he heard such things being espoused. Klobuchar began the debate, like almost all other candidates on stage, with a criticism of Bernie Sanders. But hers was particularly problematic, as it was both unoriginal and untrue. The math does not add up. In fact, just on 60 Minutes this weekend, he said he wasn't going to rattle through the nickels and the dimes. Well, let me tell you just how many nickels and dimes we're talking about. Nearly $60 trillion. Do you know how much that is? For all his programs? That is 3 times the American economy. Not the federal government, the entire American economy. So this argument borrows quite a bit from a line Buttigieg spouted out during the Nevada debate. He claimed that the budget hole in Bernie Sanders' plan is bigger than the size of the entire economy of the United States. I feel like I let Pete off the hook a little too much for this. I think I said it was deceptive but didn't really expound too much on why, but it is incredibly misleading if not a total lie. It is so false and destructive to the value of truth that PolitiFact rated it as half true. Why? Well, first let's just use our common sense. Do you really think that Bernie Sanders' plans, as socialist and idealistic and divorced from reality as moderates might take them to be, could actually cost as much as the entire US economy, let alone cause a budget hole of unexplained costs to be larger than the entire US economy? I don't care how lofty you think free college, universal healthcare, and free childcare are, European countries do these things all the time, and many of them are prospering economically. So what's the problem with their math? Well, they're accurately describing the size of the US economy, roughly $21.4 trillion in 2019. But then they're comparing this figure to plans that include 10 years of spending. Whether it's Bernie's healthcare plans or his whole platform, the costs associated that are often talked about are always accounting for 10 years. Now, when it comes to these costs, Amy and Pete both chose the higher estimates, which tend to exaggerate the issue, but I have no serious problem with this. Everyone picks the numbers that are politically convenient when multiple projections are available. But if you want to compare 10 years of Bernie policy costs to the US economy, you have to look at 10 years of GDP, not one. The latest CBO estimate amounts to around $300 trillion of GDP by 2030. So what Pete said was more than the size of the entire US economy was actually just 8% of the US economy. And what Amy described as 3 times the entire economy was actually, at best, 20% of the economy. The Medicare for All plan alone, page 8, clearly says it'll kick 149 million Americans off their current health insurance in 4 years. That's also deceptive. The claim gives the impression that Sanders' plan would leave people without health insurance, when in fact it does the opposite. Sanders and Warren, in fact, have the only plans that guarantee universal coverage. Sanders' plan would only kick people off their current plans insofar as they would force them to switch over to a government plan, which in the vast majority of cases means more healthcare coverage for a lower price tag. Once Klobuchar stopped trying to make somewhat deceptive arguments about healthcare and got down to the nitty-gritty, I think she actually had great things to say. She talked about improving healthcare access in rural areas, as well as creating incentives to have people get vocational training for in-demand health-related jobs, like nursing assistants and home healthcare workers. In the midst of that, she also criticized tuition-free college, calling it paying for rich kids to go to school. My only issue with this is the description of college for all as paying for rich kids to go to school. I mean, free public college under a universal system just means extending what we already do with public elementary, middle, and high schools to colleges. You can agree or disagree with this policy, but there's a reasonable argument to make that in the 21st century, a college education is kind of like what a high school education was when public high schools became a thing. So you can easily argue that this is just a natural extension of principles we're already living. Describing it as paying for rich kids to go to school is a little much. It's about everyone chipping in so everybody's kids get to go to school. Now, Amy also made pretty good arguments about her own abilities to get elected and to get things done. There was a little cherry picking here, but the arguments are fair enough to make. She cited a Vanderbilt University study that placed her as the most effective Democrat in the US Senate on 15 metrics. She also talked about her own history of being elected in Republican districts. Really, the biggest problem for her electability argument is all the polls I showed you earlier in this video. Polls show Sanders and Biden to be the most electable, not Klobuchar. At any rate, here was what I thought was her best moment in the debate. I want to take this out of politics right now and talk to the American people because this is so serious. I'm not going to give my website, I'm going to give the CDC's website, which is cdc.gov. Now this is the Amy Klobuchar I love and would like to see more of. Deciding to take a moment to share the CDC's website rather than her own is a classy move and the right thing to do. It might be political posturing as it shows up Pete, who previously promoted his own page, but I'll take posturing if the posture is positive. Like several others, Amy Klobuchar had a mixed performance, and this simply isn't good enough when you're not doing well in the polls. Overall, it's a loss. Tom Steyer too had a mixed performance, but the mix leaned heavily towards bad. Steyer returned to the debate stage apparently after a revelation that despite his frequent praise of Bernie Sanders in past debates, he's now extremely worried about the potentiality of Sanders securing the nomination. Steyer is not the first temporary Bernie ally to turn against him now that he's the frontrunner, but as I've already argued in this video, there are strong arguments against Sanders and weak arguments against Sanders. Then there's Steyer's approach. No argument at all. Bernie Sanders' analysis is right. The difference is I don't like his solutions. I don't believe that a government takeover of large parts of the economy makes any sense for working people or for families. Why? Why bother explaining? But no matter, Steyer did eventually come up with an argument against Bernie Sanders. See if you can place where he might have got this one from. This conversation shows a huge risk for the Democratic Party. We're looking at a party that has decided that we're either going to support someone who is a democratic socialist or someone who has a long history of being a Republican. If you guessed Pete Buttigieg, you're correct. Pete made the exact argument multiple times in the Nevada debate. Steyer is essentially paraphrasing this argument about extremes from a guy who, in previous debates, Steyer criticized for a lack of experience and for not taking climate change seriously enough. Now let's see if you guys can guess who was making the following talking point prior to Steyer. 21st century warfare is cyber warfare. That's right, also Pete Buttigieg. Although to be fair, I think Yang also made arguments along these lines, so we would have accepted that answer as well. Okay, this next one isn't Pete Buttigieg, I promise. I believe I'm the only person on this stage who believes in reparations for slavery. Something happened. We should have a formal commission on race to retell the story of the last 400 plus years in America of African Americans, of systematic legal injustice, discrimination, and cruelty, but also 400 plus years of contribution in terms of building America and leading America from a moral standpoint. Yes, Steyer's talked about reparations himself before, but his talking points come quite clearly from Marianne Williamson. Although to be fair, she put a specific number on her plan. So point being, Steyer borrowed a number of lines and policy ideas from other candidates. But I don't point these out just to point out how unoriginal he is. I honestly selected these clips because I thought they were the strongest things he had to say. It just so happens that all of his good stuff is borrowed. That's kind of a problem. On the upside for Steyer, however, he did do a reasonable job of blocking an attack issued by Joe Biden. Well, my good friend at the end of this platform, he in fact bought a system that was a private prison system after he knew that in fact what happened was that they hogtied young men in prison here in this state. They in fact made sure that in Georgia that they didn't have health care for the people who were being held. They in fact went on and he said after he knew that, he bought it and that he was proud of his accomplishment. Steyer explained that he did buy stock in a private prison company thinking that they would do a better job, and after investigating it, he decided to sell it. He said he then went on to fight against private prisons in his state until they were made illegal. Okay, so buying stock in a private prison company is bad, but then he sold it and went on to fight until private prisons in his state were made illegal. I have long opposed private prisons, and I would take that deal, so I think he effectively deflected the damage. He also struck Biden back pretty hard with a reference to his past support of tough on crime legislation, and Biden's best response to that was calling him a Johnny-come-lately. On balance, it was a pretty poor debate for Steyer, but he wasn't the worst performing candidate on stage. In fact, he wasn't even the worst performing billionaire. While sorting through who had a good debate and who had a bad one was particularly difficult for the 10th Democratic debate, it's pretty clear that Bloomberg was the biggest loser. Sure, he had an even worse debate last time around, but that isn't saying much. And even his joke about previous debate failure fell fairly flat. I really am surprised that all of these my fellow contestants up here, I guess would be the right word for it, given no one pays attention to the clock, I'm surprised they show up because I would have thought after I did such a great job in beating them last week that they'd be a little afraid to do that. Candidates, Bloomberg. Candidates was the word you were looking for. This isn't a game show. The prize is the presidency, not a brand new car. Even while he was well aware that his last performance didn't cut it, and he reportedly spent a lot of effort in trying to turn it around for this debate, Bloomberg still didn't manage to get his act together, even when it came to issues that had already come up. On the issue of stop and frisk, Bloomberg's remarks on the subject were essentially a repeat of his inadequate responses in Nevada. Bloomberg also didn't have adequate responses for the charges that his company created a hostile work environment for women. One of the big mistakes he had in Nevada surrounding this issue was trivializing the matter, saying that some women maybe didn't like a joke he told. Well, he made the same mistake again, referring to the entire matter as a sideshow. Elizabeth Warren responded to this with her own story about pregnancy discrimination. She talked about how she was forced to leave a job she loved as a special education teacher when she got pregnant, but at least she didn't have someone tell her, "Kill it," as Mayor Bloomberg apparently said to one of his employees. Bloomberg denies ever saying this, but the words aren't pulled out of thin air. A sales representative from Bloomberg LP, Sakiko Sakai, alleged that he said that to her in a lawsuit filed in 1997. She also alleged that he repeated the order before muttering under his breath in frustration about the number of women who had become pregnant at the company. Bloomberg may now deny ever having said this, but his company settled with the plaintiff in 2000 for an undisclosed amount. What the senator did suggest was that we release these women from the non-disclosure agreements. I did that 2 days later, and my company has said that we will not use non-disclosure agreements ever again. The senator has got it, and I don't know what else she wants us to do. We're following exactly what she asked to do, and the trouble is, with this senator, enough is never enough for what this. I'm going to have to start focusing on some of these other things. We just cannot continue to relitigate this every time. We did what she asked, and thank you. We've probably made the world better because of it. And by my company renouncing using these, we've probably changed, hopefully, the corporate landscape all across America. While Elizabeth Warren didn't get a chance to respond to this, the idea that he fully fulfilled her request is not particularly serious. His company announced that his company would not use non-disclosure agreements in the future, and identified 3 women bound by NDAs who they would offer releases to. But it isn't clear how many others are still bound by such agreements, and Bloomberg has not said that he would release any and all women currently bound by such agreements, which is what Warren and Biden suggested he do during the Nevada debate. At any rate, any goodwill generated from the positive steps he's taken so far is somewhat rolled back by how much he congratulated himself here for taking those steps. Speaking of generating goodwill, Bloomberg attempted to do so by making very obvious claims, which he apparently saw as bold. I know that if I were black, my success would have been a lot harder to achieve, and I know a lot of black people that if they were white, it would have been a lot easier for them. Yeah, of course that's true. It does not make you a hero to say this. Bloomberg also tried to pander to black voters by pointing to endorsements from black officials. I have over 100 black elected officials that have endorsed me. When it comes to endorsements, of course, Biden has the most generally and the most endorsements from the Congressional Black Caucus. More importantly, the endorsements of public officials, while arguably important in many cases, is in no way the same thing as support from the people. According to a recent poll by Morning Consult, Bernie Sanders has the most support from black primary voters, followed by Joe Biden. Bernie has an overwhelming share of younger black voters, 52% of those aged 18 to 29, while Biden leads amongst older black voters, 44% of those over 65. Bloomberg is in third place when it comes to black support, which is actually quite high when you consider his previous support for stop and frisk and some of the uglier comments he's made regarding race and crime. Speaking of ugly comments, Bloomberg made plenty of troublesome remarks during the South Carolina debate. Here was one I found particularly troublesome. I have been training for this job since I stepped on the pile that was still smoldering on 9/11. Gratuitous references to 9/11 were a hallmark of Rudy Giuliani's unsuccessful campaign for the presidency. Trying to score political points from this tragedy was seen by Republican voters to be craven. But at least Giuliani had something to brag about. He actually responded to the crisis in a way that a lot of people found brave or inspiring, and he actually was the mayor at the time. Bloomberg would not become mayor until 2002. Here was another problematic speech for Bloomberg. Let's just go on the record. They talk about 40 Democrats, 21 of those people that I spent $100 million to help elect. All the new Democrats who came in, put Nancy Pelosi in charge, and gave the Congress the ability to control this president. I got them. You can hear the Freudian slip here, where Bloomberg stops just short of saying that he bought them. Whether or not Bloomberg believes that he owns the politicians whose campaigns he financed. This is the fundamental, systematic problem with American elections that many Democratic, Independent, and Republican voters are disgusted by. Probably the biggest problem with Bloomberg's candidacy is that Americans across the political spectrum do not want their politicians to be bought by special interests, lobbies, corporations, and wealthy people. That corruption is, perhaps ironically, one of the things that helped to get Trump elected, as he railed against what he called the swamp. Well, as a mega donor, Bloomberg has long been part of that swamp. Touting his experience in buying elections is probably not going to improve his favorability for any Americans who don't currently work for the DNC. On policy matters, Bloomberg exposed a lot of his still present Republican leaning. For instance, he criticized legalization because there is not enough research about the dangers of cannabis, and the evidence we have is worrisome. But perhaps Bloomberg's biggest weakness of all was in the arena of foreign affairs. If Bernie Sanders took some heat for accurately pointing to improvements in healthcare and education made by Castro's regime in Cuba, it is unconscionable to think that Bloomberg shouldn't receive backlash for essentially advancing an argument that China has a democracy. And in terms of whether he is a dictator, he does serve at the behest of the Politburo, their group of people, but there's no question he has a tremendous amount of power. He not only has a tremendous amount of power, he's also changed rules to allow himself to potentially be president for life. The Politburo, of course, is not a legitimate check on his authority and is not a democratically elected body. As one writer for The Atlantic put it, the flaws in China's political system are obvious. The government doesn't even make a pretense of holding national elections and punishes those who openly call for multi-party rule. The press is heavily censored and the internet is blocked. Top leaders are unconstrained by the rule of law. Even more worrisome, repression has ramped up since Xi Jinping took power in 2012, suggesting that the regime is increasingly worried about its legitimacy. Bloomberg, speaking as if China's government is not so bad, fails to serve both the truth and his campaign. It's not only false to insinuate that China has a fairly democratic system, it's an incredibly unpopular falsehood. Americans may very well want a leader who believes that America needs to work with China, but who wants an American president defending their corrupt political system? America already, in my view, does too much to cater to the fragile ego of China's leaders. For instance, pretending that Taiwan doesn't exist, but pretending that the Politburo is somehow either a serious or legitimate check on Xi Jinping is ridiculous. So all in all, despite improving somewhat from his last debate performance, Bloomberg was decidedly the worst contestant at the 10th Democratic debate. As far as winners go, really only Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden qualified clearly, and Biden was probably the top performer overall. His champion performance at the debate was followed days later by a sweeping victory in the South Carolina primary. No doubt his campaign hopes this will bump him enough in the polls to land him in strong contention for Super Tuesday. But as far as that goes, it's Bernie Sanders who still seems to be the best answer to this question.